Hello everyone. I'm going to discuss with you the hierarchy of exception classes in Java. First of all, we can see that the topmost parent class of exception is the throwable class. By using this class, further exception classes have been made. For example, exception class and error class have been derived from throwable class, means after inheriting the throwable class, exception class and error class have been made. Further, after inheriting the error class, class not found exception was made, IO exception was made, runtime exception was made, and many more classes were made as well, which are not listed here. And further inheriting the runtime exception class, arithmetic exception was made, null pointer exception was made, index out of bounds exception was made, illegal argument exception was made, and many more classes were made. Okay, and if we see below, error class, by using the error class, linkage error class was made, virtual machine error class was made, and many more classes. Okay, so in this particular hierarchy, I'm not showing you all the classes here because there are many inbuilt classes, exception classes in Java, so it's not feasible to show them here. And definitely we are not going to learn all of them, so only the common ones I'm showing you here, which you most likely to face when you write a program. For example, most likely error you face is, as a beginner, arithmetic exception, index out of bound exception. We'll deal with that later also, okay, how these error occurs and some more errors. So the point is, I'm just showing you here only the common exception occurring at a beginner level. Okay. Further, we can see that I have grouped some exception classes inside the red portion. So you can see this. First one is runtime exception, then its subclasses, and error class as well as its subclasses. You can see here these classes. All of these classes as well as their subclasses fall under the category of unchecked exception classes. There are two categories of exception defined by Java. First category is checked exception class and second category is unchecked exception class. Okay, we'll see that in a moment, but first of all we're actually looking at which classes fall under the category of unchecked exception and which are falling under the category of checked exception. So unchecked exceptions are just highlighted here, and rest of the classes which do not fall into this red circular part, those are throwable class, exception class, class not found exception, IO exception, and many more classes which are not listed here. All of them fall under the category of checked exception. So only thing which you have to remember is this portion, which classes fall under the category of checked exception. This one, unchecked exception, I mean. This portion, runtime exception and all of its subclasses, as well as these classes. Rest, all of, if I just skip these portions, rest all of the classes belong to the checked exception. So let's try to study what is checked exception and what is unchecked exception. Let's first of all see what is unchecked exception. Unchecked exception are those kind of exception classes whose handling is not verified during compile time. I repeat, those exceptions whose handling is not verified during the compile time fall under the category of unchecked exceptions. Okay, they are the direct subclasses of runtime exceptions, as I have shown you. Runtime exception classes. Runtime exception class was further inherited by many more classes like arithmetic exception, illegal argument exception, and so on. Okay, so let's try to understand what do I mean by this unchecked exception. Let's see this code here. a very simple code, int val is equal to a divided by 0. So the compiler first of all checks that what kind of error could be generated by this line. Obviously you can say that arithmetic exception. Okay, so arithmetic exception kind of error could be generated from this line while my program is running, and that particular class fall into which category? So we have just noticed in our previous chart that that falls into the category of unchecked exception, meaning that the compiler tells you that no need to write this line inside the try catch block. You write this line inside the try block, or you do not write it, so I won't check it for you. Okay, so you can run without the try block. You can execute this line without the try block. Okay, you can write this line inside the try block also. You can write this line without the try block also. So this is called unchecked exception, whose handling is not verified during the compile time. Means compiler will not force you to write this particular line inside the try block. If the compiler forces you to write this line inside the try block, then that is a checked exception, which I'm going to discuss right now. Okay, so right now it's an unchecked exception. Okay, what other kind of exception classes could fall into this category? So I've listed here: arithmetic exception, index out of bound exception, null pointer exception, class cast exception, input mismatch exception, illegal argument exception, number format exception, and the list goes on and on. Okay, so I have shown you some examples here. So if you are curious to know what other classes fall into this unchecked exception category, okay, and next category, as I told you, is checked exception. Those exceptions whose handling is verified during the compile time are fall into the category of checked exception. Let's take an example. Have a look at this line where I am trying to make a connection with a file. I am trying to open a file with this line: file input stream fp is equal to new file input stream, and I am trying to open a file in the reading mode. Okay, so this now the compiler checks that while executing this line, what kind of error can be generated. It could be in broad sense I can say IO exception, input output exception. So IO exception falls in what category? It falls into the category of checked exception. So compiler will force you to write this particular line inside the try block. Otherwise it will start giving you error कि this is not written inside the try block. So write this line inside the try block, otherwise I'll start giving you error. Okay, so this is a checked exception where compiler forces you to write that line inside the try block. Okay, why the compiler forces us to write this line inside the try block? The reason could be like this. You can understand it like this, that compiler Java compiler feels that by executing this line it is likely that you are going to have runtime error. Most likely you are going to have a runtime error. So that's why Java forces us to write this line inside the try block so that your program doesn't crash. So how do we know that a particular line should be written inside the try catch block or not? So let's try to just see this thing. It's pretty simple to remember, like all those lines of code which try to make connection with the outside environment. For example, this line of code actually tried to make the connection with the outside environment, like it tried to access a file. Outside environment means by going outside my program. Okay, my programming logic is going outside my Java environment to make some connection there, and that would produce a checked exception. Further, I can have some more examples. So if you try to write in Java some SQL statement, then these kind of exceptions could be generated, which fall into the category of checked exception. If you try to make networking connections, socket connections, so these kind of errors could be generated, runtime errors could be generated. So means if you try to write some SQL statements, some database kind of statements, some networking statements, right, or file access statements inside the Java, those fall under the category of checked exception. So Java will force you to write those lines inside the try block because it feels like you are dealing with the outer environment, so they are more likely to get errors because the file may not exist, or the file might be having read write permissions. Okay, you may not be able to read or write the file, or the file may not be there, or the SQL statement might fail. You may not be able to access the database, or you may not be able to make the networking connections. So all those lines of code where the Java feels like the error is most likely to occur because you are dealing with the outer environment. Okay, your program is dealing with the outer environment, so Java treat them as checked exception and hence will force you to write those lines inside the try block. Okay, so this is what is checked exception all about. So in the next video I'll just tell you about the demonstration how checked and unchecked exception work with the help of my example program. Okay.